Welcome, wandering souls and lost sailors, to the Ship of the Dead podcast.
Ahoy!
Yar.
We are back on the Ship of the Dead. I'm here with Quartermaster Tyler.
Hi.
We leave for Gen Con like in 2 days. Are you excited?
I'm super excited. My bags are all stacked and all my different rule books, and had to count out a bunch of different dice sets. I'm really stoked to eat con food.
How many events are we running?
I think 12. I think 11. 11
It's
events.
like 12 and then at least one panel.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, it's going to be a
and
fun
there's two
week,
events being run online too by our awesome.
So that's 14
team.
Limithron events. It's going to be an intense week.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome.
Well, before we get to tonight's episode or today's episode, or however you want to look at it, with Andrew Kolb of Neverland and Oz fame, I think we have a few listener questions. If you want to contribute to this segment of the show, you can email shipofthedead@limithron.com. All right, Tyler, what's first?
All right. I got some bottles here with messages in it. And let me. All right. Critical Troll writes, if Limithron is the pirate wizard of light, what are the rest of the crew, classes, and archetypes?
Oh, man. I don't even know the answer to this. So Limithron is my like Sindarin translation of light wizard.
The Elvish language from Tolkien's world.
Yeah, one of Tolkien's Elvish languages. I think that my crew are probably level 0 pirates mostly. And then I have a few like, arcane swashbuckler types that, are able to, I don't know. I think Limithron in his homebrew world, he's like the only wizard. There's no other ones. He's like Gandalf if like Gandalf showed up in the Caribbean. That's my.
I totally took this question as what did you think? What class am I and what class is Alan?
Oh, okay. Well, why don't you answer for you?
Well, I mean, I love Rangers and Aragorn, but I'm much more of a paladin style with the faith being friendship.
Yeah, I was going to say for Alan, his role in Limithron makes him kind of like the cleric.
Yeah.
Because he's like super assist, but we'd be screwed without him,
Yeah, we send him something and then he casts heal on it and makes it better.
That's 100%. He's definitely the cleric. Yeah.
Brett asks, how does it feel for Pirate Borg to have exploded with so much popularity? What were you expecting when you clicked the button to go live on Kickstarter? Now that the book has been sent to editors, what pages are you most proud of or most excited to share?
Well, I appreciate the vote of confidence. I don't know that I would say it's exploded with popularity. It's not out yet. So, I mean, some of the backers are playing it, but I think I'll feel more pumped about its popularity when I feel like it's popular.
I mean, it did pretty well on Kickstarter.
It did well on Kickstarter.
5,000% funded.
Yes, it did well on Kickstarter. I was blown away by how well it did. So I guess I was hoping to hit my goal on day one. And then, maybe get to like the cover all the stretch goals by the end. And I think we covered them all in like the first couple hours. So.
I remember within the first day, you and I were on the phone being like, dude, you got to add more stretch goals.
Yeah, I know.
What's it going to be?
I just didn't think.
And you're like, should I go to this? How many 100,000? What? Like,
yeah, just based on like other projects in its sphere, like it just did way better than I would have thought.
So what pages are you most excited to like share? To
well, ever since we demoed Alchemy RPG, I like have been revisualizing how I want to play games. So I started to do these like Darkest Dungeon background style spreads where it's like you're looking at what the characters might have had behind them in Darkest Dungeon. So I've got this one that's like a swamp and one that's like a jungle. So I really like those. Those work really well for backgrounds and really artistic spreads, but they also are fun to make. So I'm proud of those. I'm really proud of the 3-level jungle temple. I'm also really proud of the brand new character. It's like a cheat sheet. It's kind of like a Mothership style character creation. You can use it as a character sheet with just a few lookups, but it has everything you need to make a character on 2 pages.
Yeah,
really cool.
It's really awesome. Really easy to hand someone, especially at a con, and have them just like roll up a character with nothing else. All right, Dead Boy 23. He asks, besides Hot Springs Island and Neverland 5e, Are there any other settings/adventures you would recommend for playing Pirate Borg with?
Well, I can't recommend those two enough. I kind of want to put both of those islands as in our West Marches campaign. If we can like find out where they are, people can go to either one. I think that'd be really fun. I think Isle of Dread is a no-brainer. It's a BX module that came in the expert box. It would take a little bit of conversion to get it into Pirate Borg, but very, very little. That being said, there are a couple like piratey Morkborg adventures, which you can put in with no conversion. I would call Fiskborg by Richard Kelly, which is basically like a fishing in Morkborg. Temple of the Kraken God by Christian Eichhorn, who did a spread in Pirate Borg. And also Madeline Ember's Corpse Wake Cove. But also we have a spreadsheet, which I'm going to put in the show notes for this episode, that it like lives on our Discord server, that has a list of like every pirate adventure worth running and like what system it came from, as well as another tab for like music and books that are all pirate themed. So yeah, check those out.
Hexter asks, what would you consider personally to be the ideal setup for playing Pirate Borg in person, accessory wise? What would best represent the Pirate Borg aesthetic at a table, do you think?
Oh, well, obviously a bunch of printed huge Limithron ship maps is a no-brainer.
Yarr.
That being said, I don't think that you need battle maps with Pirate Borg the same way you need them in like 5e. So I would say I definitely ship models. I use models from Oak and Iron from Firelock Games, but you can also use Pirates of the Spanish Main models for naval combat, and then like a cool ocean mat. You're going to need that for sure, because that's really fun to like sit around the table and everybody has their own little ship. And then I like battle maps for the ships because it's very tactical knowing where you are on the ship and where you're moving to and from, even if you're not tracking squares. You could use cool minis. Like I would love to see, there's this one guy on Instagram who has like really, really incredible 3D printed ship models. Like that's really, really cool. But given at the rate that ships come and go in a Pirate Borg campaign, you might want to have a whole different, you might have to pretend your ship is a different kind than it actually is,
Finally, Brett asks, what's next for you?
Oh man, I'm going to take a break. Not really. I'm totally kidding. We still have a lot to finish for the Kickstarter. The book has been sent out to the editors, but we have to lay out the 5e zine. We've got the stats written for that. We have to complete all the Foundry modules and pack up all the stuff. We have to lay out all the cards still. So there's still some work to do on Pirate Borg. But when that project ships, when it's done, I think we're probably going to switch to the Dark Caribbean, which is going to be our next Kickstarter. It's like a big fat setting book that you can use in your pirate campaigns to explore the Dark Caribbean. And yeah, that's it.
Sweet. Well, thanks for sending in messages, everybody, and keep them coming. We'll check them out next time.
Yeah, you can hit us on the Discord or send us an email at shipofthedead@limithron.com. Welcome to the Ship of the Dead. I'm your host, Luke Stratton. With me today is Andrew Kolb, the illustrator and writer of Neverland 5e and the upcoming Wizard of Oz 5e. Is that the working title?
Yeah, just Oz.
Oz 5e. Andrew, I'm very excited to have you on here. For those who listened to episode 1 with Jacob Hurst, you know that I discovered your book in Barnes & Noble, and it basically ruined my entire role-playing game experience. I had never really tried the OSR, and through your book, I found Hot Springs Island, and now here we are running an OSR podcast. What have you done?
I'm sorry. In true Canadian fashion, I apologize.
That's fair. I want to start with not necessarily your role-playing game origins, but how did this Neverland project start as a creative project, but even more so as like a commercial project? Like, how did you go from like, I've never really done much with role-playing games to like, here's a book in every Barnes and Noble in the country. Can you tell us that story?
The quick background from the concept of Neverland is that it kind of arose from running enough games with players who had never played any sort of tabletop RPG before. Like I was kind of like the gateway. And in running other adventures, found it was really kind of hard to get them to buy into a fantasy world and also the kind of like mechanics of the game at the same time. It was kind of like really a heavy load. So in starting to kind of explore somewhat familiar properties, made that a bit easier. Like I think once you kind of start to say, okay, here are the rules and here are these things to do, then that kind of becomes what they focus on when they kind of already know, oh, I get mermaids, I get pirates, like all these things that I have absorbed from the zeitgeist. I know how to interact with these things. That was kind of the impetus for it. Saying babies first, a tabletop RPG feels reductive or maybe a little insulting, but essentially it was just kind of like a spoonful of sugar helping the medicine go down.
The player buy-in, if you will, is like built in if you're playing on Neverland.
Right.
Yeah. You're like, oh, can I fly? Do you have fairy dust? You know, it's like you don't have to explain the mechanics for those kinds of things.
Right. And then when we start to get into the nuances of that stuff, like once they find the fairy dust, then we kind of explain what roles to do and things like that. So it's kind of only half the effort. And I'm also talking like players where it's like family who are doing this to humor me, things like that. But in building it bigger and bigger, that's where I was like, I think I've put in enough work that I want to share this with others. I hadn't really drawn anything. It was mostly just kind of like Word docs and spreadsheets. Being an illustrator, and I think that's maybe also part of this journey too, is like my background is more in illustration and design, and RPGs and D&D was a hobby. So because my background is also in like children's picture books, I have a literary agent. So I have someone that I work with to connect me with authors or make sure that like all my deals are fair, like the stuff that I don't want to kind of and can't deal with or navigate. So I essentially like had enough written and had the map illustrated and pitched it to her like I would pitch a children's book. So it wasn't complete. I mean, like it was complete in that I could run a game in it, but it wasn't like the entire book already done. For people who are interested in the publishing world in general, that's usually how it's done, is like it's all written, but it's not, here's the PDF, just go take it to the printer. Like usually there's some collaboration.
So the publisher is Andrews McNeil, or is there like a sub-publisher that you worked with?
No, yeah, it's directly with AMU or Andrews McNeil, yeah.
I mean, I know they're a little bit more of a traditional publisher, but like a lot of these RPGs get kickstarted. Was there any discussion of that? Or were they like, we're going to go straight to, you know, normal brick and mortar?
No, they were totally ready for it. So in presenting this to my agent, she's like, okay, I don't get any of this, because she's in the world of novels and picture books. And I'm like, okay, but like here it is. And she says, actually, no, I know a publisher who is looking for or like wants to expand into kind of games. So that was AMU. And I was really lucky that they liked what I had, because I mean, like with all of my other books and kind of pitching other books, it tends to go to, I don't know, half a dozen or even double digits of publishers saying yes or no. Every time it's a no, except for the one that says yes. But AMU was really great. They saw it and they saw something in it. And then that is work we kind of started figuring out, okay, what do we do here? And that's where we kind of bolstered the book and the concept a bit more and added players and handouts and the extra stories at the back and the sketchbook, all these extra cool things that I hadn't really kind of thought about, but they really nurtured.
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciate about this book is it, and I even saw in your mock-ups of the cover in the back, that it almost seems like it almost started as like a complete game, or it almost is a complete game if you just understand basic D&D mechanics. You know, like there are character sheets, there's a world map, there's exploration and interaction rules explained. It's like all you need is that tiny little player's handbook and you've got like a full game here.
Well, I really designed it as being kind of like truly system agnostic. Whether or not we go into the character or the stat blocks, I think that's where it shines the most. And in working with AMU, we were like, okay, I think we could skew it a bit more towards 5e, which I was open to and fully support. But yeah, my goal was to make something that really, once you kind of have like the skeleton of a system, then this really kind of globs onto it and makes it just so much more, which is also why I'm really thrilled that like folks have embraced it in the OSR too, because like that's a world that I'm not as versed in, but really adore. So kind of like taking all their kind of like learnings or all kind of the principles, but then applying it to something that is a little maybe universal.
We can just go ahead and go here. Like this book is very unique in that it is advertised as a 5e book. That's why I picked it up. Because at the time, that's all I knew. And I'm not one of those OSR 5e haters, but those people exist. And when this book comes up, people are like, well, it says 5e, but whoa. It's really an OSR book with some 5e stuff in there. But I really think for people like me, it's a good bridge because you've got things like NPCs have flaws and distinctive traits and kind of the normal things you expect from a 5e NPC. And then you have the resistances and immunities, but then you kind of break the rules a bit and you're like, well, like the example I have here is that Captain Hook is immune to charm, and his weakness is ticking clocks or visible crocodiles. And it's like, well, in 5e, there are always these like hard locked things. And I think that's such a creative way to use the framework of 5e in your own setting. Can you maybe talk about how did you get to that? Or was it like the cart before the horse kind of thing?
Essentially, all of the kind of like design decisions came out of running enough games and going, this is what I need at the table. And I think my big thing is the stats or the kind of like bonuses or the
saves.
Yeah, the saves are a good example of when I would run stat blocks from the monster manual, I would usually condense it down to just be like, I don't care what the charisma is of this zombie. Like, that does not matter to me. And it just feels like filler. And that's what I really kind of love about the OSR is just like stripping it down to like the essentials. And that was everything that I kind of designed for the stat blocks was like, what do I need to know? And just kind of run with it. So between 3 numbers, you should be able to figure out, okay, yeah, Hook is good at this. He's great at this. And he'd be terrible at this. So that makes sense. And kind of when it comes to ticking clocks, it's like, well, I'm sure there's going to be a system where that is more important. And I'm not going to just leave it out because 5e doesn't have a specific clock resistance or weakness. So it's still relevant. It's not exclusively relevant to 5e. Or maybe someone casts a minor illusion and then it becomes a clock. So now I know, oh yeah, okay, if they need to save to figure that out, maybe they are going to roll a disadvantage because it's a clock. I trust the people running it.
So my brother and I are working on porting Pirate Borg, which is, Morkborg Grimdark Pirates.
Right.
We have a 5e stat zine that people could add on. And him and I have been working on it together. And I'm like, Morkborg doesn't have any resistances or anything. And I'm like, look, we need to add these because they're an important part of what makes 5e fun. Like, oh, that didn't work. Will this weapon work? And I was like, look, you need to look at Neverland because he does a really great job being like, well, this certain kind of monster, it has a resistance that's not in the player's handbook, So I think it's a great tool for any DM to think about like special tricks that might apply to certain monsters.
I think what I really enjoy about writing that sort of stuff is it starts to make those things more important in the world. There's not really a lot in 5th edition about kind of like iron weapons, but when we talk about fairies, then it becomes crucial. So when you start to see that characters or creatures are weak or resistant to iron weapons, it's like, oh, okay, then I guess that should be more important. Like, I think then when you roll on the loot table and you tell someone, oh, you find like an iron short sword, it's like, oh, why is that noted? Like, why is it not just a short sword? Or do I get any bonuses? No. Okay, but you made a point to mention that. So I'm going to pay attention to this or start to kind of explore it. If there's one word that I can use to describe the spirit of Neverland, it is kind of exploration. So that I hope will drive that to go, oh, why is iron important? And then you start to explore and kind of poke around into the corners and find out more.
I want to dip back here and actually read this little blurb about the stats, just so people who don't have the book know what we're talking about. You say, only 3 save bonuses are provided. Excellent, mediocre, and poor. For any given check or roll, use the bonus that makes the most sense for the creature and whether they be great, fine, or bad at that check. If in doubt, no bonus. Add the first 2 numbers together for the 2 hit bonus if this makes sense for your system. Above all else, use common sense. And I feel like some people really love the crunch on 5e, but one of the things that this book and the OSR have helped me as a DM is, like you said, I don't care about a skeleton's charisma. I certainly don't care about its written number. So when there's like a block of all these things, all these numbers that I'm just supposed to ignore, why not just give me the 3 things that matter? So I commend you. You have a honorary Ship of the Dead Captain for the Day title for your stat blocks in Neverland 5e.
Oh, accepted and appreciated. I think at the end of the day, all my decisions were based on, can I run this at the table? And whether or not we're going to touch on Oz, that was also, again, still the same drive of like, what do I need? Why do I not run city adventures? Oh, it's because I don't have this, this, and this, or because like I don't know what to do with this. That's what I do. I kind of like make the book I want to run, right? Like, I think that's with any kind of creative endeavor.
Absolutely. I mean, I think every creator that's creating from a place of passion has to have this kind of approach, I think.
Oh yeah. These books are so much work. As someone who comes from picture books, I mean, like, I think 32 illustrations is enough. Then I get into these RPG books and I'm like, oh, I love it. And I need to illustrate each creature and character because I want to be able to see them. But what am I doing? Why am I doing 100 of these? It's just like, it's because I'm really proud of it at the end. Yeah, it's a labor of love, 100%.
Yeah, I feel like you and I are in not not a very large community of people who are writing and illustrating their entire book. And I have to say, like, some people are like, man, I wish I could do that. And I was like, dude, it's torture, because every time I'm like, okay, I need to add a spread for this mechanic, I'm immediately like, well, what's going to go there? What's the picture? And then I'm spending 2 days drawing a picture because I can. Oh,
right.
Man.
Yeah, it's really a luxury. Like, I appreciate someone who's writing and then paying an illustrator to kind of like fill in those gaps. I'm like, yeah, like the budget changes when you're paying someone else or when it's collaborative like that. But at the end of the day, that's also where I think it's important for someone who can do both to really kind of like embrace both of like, I got to do this, but also like, I have this opportunity, I got to make the most of it. So I also, when I approach my illustrations, go, what storytelling can I do in this too? Like, not just filler, but like, what can I give someone reading the book and go, oh, this is something that even just from reading the pages, I've gotten so much info, but now I'm going to get that much more from the drawing of like a plot point, or like, oh, I hadn't thought about the trinkets, or like what this would look like. There's an illustration in Neverland where it's around kind of like the fairy trades. And I really wanted to show a fairy that I hadn't really explicitly described in the other books. Like, he's pretty short and he's kind of big nose and big ears and a big top hat. And kind of just like, I don't know, some flair that you don't get from elsewhere in the book. And he's on a stump, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, this would be like a fun kind of scene to play out. I don't know, just like make the most of whatever you're given. It's as dense and condensed as possible.
Well, and I think it really helps readers and GMs that, like, I'm a visual consumer, and a book thick in theme and illustration might give me more of the setting than 300 pages of text. And usually does, you know, like books like this and Morkborg and Hot Springs Island. Like, the reason those books grab my attention is because I pick them up and I'm in the world right away. I don't have to read 300 pages. So I think it works.
Oh, well, thanks.
One of the things I want to talk about that I'm sure you're doing in Oz, but we've seen it in print with Neverland, is the way you've taken the existing lore, if you will, and run it through the funnel of an RPG. By this, I specifically mean like how Wendy is a hag and John Darling is a lich, and you have kind of all these tropes you expect from a tabletop role-playing game smashed into Neverland. Can you maybe just talk about like the origins of those? Like, was the idea like, oh, the kids are stuck on Neverland forever and now they're corrupted? What's the backstory here?
I think what first made it click for me was there's a line in the original book talking about the locals of Neverland that we don't really see. Like, it talks about gnomes and tailors, and I don't remember the specific line, but it mentions a hag. And between that and the tree that never stopped growing, it just clicked of like, oh yeah, like people who already know Neverland know the story of Neverland. So you want there to be elements of what's familiar. But I still, because the spirit of the book is discovery, I still want there to be new things for people who even know the books back or the films back in front, still find new things. So that was where I went, okay, what if this is like actually set well after the original book, but things like The Children That Don't Age and that kind of can keep it still feeling like it's that same time. And where I brought in the Curse of the Pirates, also because I just didn't want a bunch of factions that are strictly human. So adding that kind of element makes them feel a little more fresh from some of the others. But then that explains why they're also still the same age, because they just like aren't aging, which also plays into the themes of the original book. I don't know. I wish I could give you a clear like, oh, I was in my bed journaling one night and it all came together. And because I'm working on this from all different angles, from like the illustration and just kind of mapping and things like that, sometimes it's just one thing influences the other of going, okay, well, if this is set in the future, why aren't the pirates older? Okay, this is why. And then, okay, if the humans are older, then what are they doing? Okay, well, I can't just have 3 old people, because then people will start to put that together. So that's where John's story is a little different than Wendy and Michael's. Like, it just all these kind of like little problems that I'm solving before I even get to typing it out, that I then go in a new direction or start to kind of figure something else out. And that's where I go, oh, like, how can I also introduce different types of characters onto the island? Because again, if they're all humans, that feels kind of bland. So let's add some flavor to it. So with John's story, that's where he starts to work with sand in a different way. Also, I'm assuming we're all okay with like tons of semi-spoilers, at least in this.
Oh, yeah. Spoiler alert. Yeah, of course.
Okay, so with John becoming a lich, then he can kind of be locked in this kind of like teenage mindset and have a kind of different approach. And then he gets to work with different things than Wendy, who is like in a swamp and kind of working with corpses and things like that. Like I just wanted there to be lots of different kind of types of experiences. So that way, no matter where you go, it's not just, oh, here's more humans or here's more human kids, things like that.
I mean, and kind of tying into that, if we could touch on this topic of the natives, because I've had a similar topic that I've struggled with, or not struggled with, but had to address in a grimdark Caribbean. You made the decision to leave out the Pickaninny tribe from the original. I just wonder if you could touch on that a bit.
For those who are only listening to this, like I'm a white man, so
Yes.
a white cis man. So I bring a very specific perspective to this in that my fear was I did not want to introduce another group, one that were strictly human, two that were kind of like built off of a problematic depiction, even at the point of when the books were originally published. But I did not want to set up a circumstance where in this D&D or tabletop setting, we are recreating real and problematic relations with an indigenous population. So while I still wanted there to be a community to reflect the themes of what that group meant in the original book, which was kind of like an indigenous population that is in touch with the island of Neverland. And also there's kind of like this relationship, a triangle between the pirates and that group in the original book and the Lost Boys. Like they kind of all interact with each other in different ways. And I liked that. And I think that's still important to kind of keep in the final book. But instead, in kind of changing that tribe to a group of dryads, it starts to play on those themes, but also in a different way. One, again, I didn't want to be another group of humans because I think that's kind of like boring. But two, that then allowed there to be kind of some more fantastical elements that still kind of like kept the same spirit of what was intended with the original text. But that's what I wanted. And then I also wanted to be able to play with the themes of the kind of like aging and the parent-child relationship and having kind of like the elders, which are kind of like these old like static trees compared to the young green sticks, or like the saplings that are kind of like more flexible, and they just kind of like interplay in different way, but also able to play with that visually too, like the smaller kind of like trees in bloom compared to the old kind of like very slow trees. It felt right.
I mean, you've taken Neverland and added more pirates, a lich, and Ents, essentially. I don't think any hardcore fantasy fans are complaining about this.
Good. And again, my goal is not to offend or to kind of like resist kind of what the original text was. With all of it, I just wanted to kind of build and make something new. And that's where I thought was, okay, this is something that doesn't need to be kept. Like Peter Pan still needs to be a young, reckless boy. Hook still needs to be afraid of the crocodile. Like there are kind of tenets that I felt were important to the spirit of Neverland. And I didn't feel that the Pickaninny tribe in general was something that was kind of like crucial to the original. So let's improve where we can. That was my goal. And the degree of success is going to be interpreted by whoever is listening or reading. But that was kind of my hope.
The basic structure of Neverland is you've got 24 hexes. I mean, I'm assuming this has got to be inspired by Hot Springs Island. If not inspired by, they're very similar. You've got 2 mile hexes. It's a tropical island of sorts. There's the clock mechanic, which is like the watch mechanic in Hot Springs Island, where you have mechanics for traveling between hexes or exploring them. Each hex has its own page with kind of what's going on in that hex, events that might happen, NPCs that you might run into. Can you just tell me about this design process and like how it unfolds for you at your game table?
Yeah, and I mean, I mentioned in the back of the book, Hot Springs Island was really kind of like what solidified a lot of what I was doing before for me, as far as like a structure that made the kind of hex crawl come together. Because before it was essentially just kind of like, I was treating it more like a point crawl. The structure of a hex crawl, which I was still kind of like new to, really wasn't something that I considered because I was so used to it being such big hexes. So Jacob and the Hot Springs crew, like condensing it down to a smaller size and just saying, oh yeah, you can make the hex whatever size you want, just kind of like unlocked it for me in my brain of just like, oh yeah, of course. It just was so obvious in front of me that I couldn't believe I couldn't see it. So that was the part of it. And then in reading through Hot Springs Island, the kind of like location-based encounters and just kind of like that routine, which was, again, a lot of stuff that I was doing running Neverland, but hadn't codified. Between that and, again, running through a number of like dungeon crawls as well and kind of having encounter tables that were specific to that level of the dungeon, it just all kind of made sense to go, okay, again, if I'm running this at the table and not knowing what hex they're going to go to, I need to be able to see everything on that page, and either I have something planned and I'm set, or if I'm not, then I need to be able to roll and figure something out pretty quickly. With Neverland and with Oz, I probably spend as much time on just the encounter table, like figuring out, okay, what does a D20 get you? And then how does that explode out into NPCs and creatures and that, as I do writing even just kind of like the core plot. Like it just takes so much time for me to try to balance out a mixture of seeing creatures versus kind of like puzzles versus things that kind of like feel into the theme, and how do I balance that out? And that was it. That was kind of like the design process, was just going, what do I need on this page to be able to run 30 minutes? And then after that 30 minutes, they'll figure it out. Does that make any sense?
Oh, yes. I mean, this is kind of world building through tables, which I find to be the best way to convey a setting to GMs, especially if you're doing, like in Hot Springs Island, they do the 3d6 curve, that you're really saying like, hey, here in the middle, this is what probably happens here. But here are some examples of things that might happen here. Like maybe the pirates will show up and raid this spot, which they don't usually do. And I think you could have put that in 2 columns of text and explained the history of what happens here, but it's just a lot easier to digest and use at the table when you're like, okay, what's happening here now? Let's roll a dice. I think it comes across well.
Oh, thank you. I think another of the big influences for me, specifically on Neverland, I think in general are the Zelda games, but I think for this one specifically was Breath of the Wild, because I really pictured in my mind me playing Breath of the Wild and going, okay, I need to find these lizards to make something or to upgrade my armor. Where do I go for that? So then I would like remember, oh yeah, I've seen them before in this area of the map, and then I fast travel and that's all fine. I wanted that to work for this hex crawl and go, oh yeah, we've seen these water horses, but we only ever see them on the river. So that's where we should go and go back. Maybe you'll roll on the encounter table and you won't see them. Maybe you will. But I think through the tables dictating that really nurtures that sort of play. Like, because there are tons of times where my players, and I mentioned the water horses because that's come up a couple times, where my players will see them and they never interact with them because they're in the distance, and then they'd like go and they submerge and that's fine. They move on. And maybe it's just a bit of flavor. But then 2 months later, when they find out, oh, we need to dive into this underwater cave system. Oh, if we get the hair from one of those water horses, we can breathe underwater for a couple hours. Where did we see that horse? Like, then it just becomes less about really directing the plot and going, no, you know this, and because of the tables, we've seen them a bunch of times here, and it hasn't been important, but it also isn't. The world feels alive because those creatures exist in that space, or you're only ever going to see the fire newts in the swamp. So at some point when they need them, they know they're going to have to spend a couple hours searching in the swamp. So again, I want them to have all the information that they need, but I think through strategic tables, then I think they're going to kind of just like find that out on their own. So that's what, yeah, it's world building through tables. I'd never thought of it that way, but that's absolutely what's happening.
I'm a big fan of Sean McCoy, who's the Mothership designer, if you're familiar. His like working ethos, if you will, is, can this paragraph be a bullet point list? Can this bullet point list be a table? Can this table be a chart? Can this chart be an illustration? So he's always trying to push it closer to being visual. And I think this book, I mean, the sheer number of tables in this book, you do a great job of that, because you're like, I need some loot. I need some weird trinkets, but they got to be Neverland trinkets. Like, there's a ton of world building just in the appendix, if you will.
And also, if you don't read those tables, there's hopefully still enough for you to run what you've got on that one page. Like, maybe you don't go into the back or find those things until later. And then we all find it together. Like, you roll on the loot table and you go, oh yeah, weird. What does this jar of apple seeds mean? And then everyone finds out together. Like, discovery for the GM as well is hopefully something that comes from it.
Absolutely. My question here on my notes is, strong Breath of the Wild element, go anywhere? Even if that means following a fallen star to see where it's fallen. I was like, when I read that, I don't know if this is from Breath of the Wild, but it seems so related, and it's such a fun mechanic. I feel like a lot of RPGs are kind of dark, especially OSR games, and this is much more of like, I mean, you obviously can get killed, and there are liches, and the crocodile could eat you, but the idea that you see a falling star land on the other side of the mountain, or like up in the clouds, and you have to go there and explore it, it just seems a very like imaginatively captivating situation.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. And I think to your question of, is there any Breath of the Wild or Zelda references, 100%. Like, it's all in the pages.
Clearly you've played Breath of the Wild. Are you like a long-time Zelda fan or like a new school Zelda fan?
My first gaming experience with Zelda was on the 64.
Ocarina of Time, yeah.
Yeah, and I'd gone back and played the older games later, but I don't know, I still remember that first Christmas getting the kind of gold cartridge, and I don't think I'd even asked for it. I'm sure my parents just went into a game store and said, we have a child who's this age, what should we get him? And thank you to whoever was working at that GameStop or EB Games, but they got it for me. And it was just something had unlocked. Like I had no idea that a game could be like this or that this was kind of what I wanted. So yeah, playing Ocarina of Time was important to me as a human.
So growing up, my brother played Ocarina and I would watch him. I was kind of more of a Doom marathon, GoldenEye, first-person shooter kind of guy. But I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, I decided to give Ocarina a go. And I think I got to about the Water Temple, and I was like, I can't believe how much stuff is in this game for like a 64 game.
Yeah.
Like I thought I was about to beat it, and I was like, oh my God, there's so much to this game. And you get older. It's such a cool game.
The influences on that, and again, I don't mean to kind of keep bringing up Oz, but I really kind of recognize, I keep pulling from different Zelda games to put into these other settings. So Breath of the Wild really kind of like seeped into Neverland. I think Majora's Mask really seeped into Oz for me.
The next kind of section after you get through the hexes is a series of very visually inspired one-page dungeons. This is kind of like you have Inside of the Crocodile, or you have the Mermaid Amphitheater, or of course my favorite is the Jolly Roger. Like, can you maybe talk about the inspiration, I guess, for the actual design of these on the page and like keying them and how, like, they're not particularly verbose in a great way for when you're running them as a GM.
I think all of my decisions were driven by what would I want at the table and what would I need? Like, so the Jolly Roger is a good example. There's like a small table in the corner that really kind of just like goes through like shipping terms, only because I know someone is going to ask or someone is going to kind of chat with or try to overhear a conversation between the pirates. So I want to have something. So, even if I'm just saying like someone's pointing to the other and saying like, you need to go clean the bow, and then making sure that they walk towards the right part of the ship, like stuff like that. So between whatever charts I include or whatever information I include, it's just enough so that way if I'm sitting down and they decide to explore this nest of this creature, that I have a starting point and go, okay, I know what I need to do, or a rough layout. Otherwise, they're all just going to be a single room, and then that goes into another single room. Like, I just wanted some flavor. As far as the design, though, I like drawing the characters. I like doing the kind of themed illustrations. I will be the first to admit that maps and anything spatial is not my strength. So it was a real challenge making all of those maps because it's just not my strong point. So some are overhead, some are more side view, because it just is like, what do I need in this space and what do I need to be able to communicate? So like the pirate stores are from a side view because it's moving vertically. So that just like made more sense to me. And then that was it. And then I just key it with kind of like the crucial information, because I'm sure other people who are far more creative will be able to build off of that.
I mean, these are really well designed for running at the table. You have, like you said, the pirate stores are from the side. You could load these into a virtual tabletop, but I think they're almost better served just, you're at a crossroads. You want to go up or down or left or right. I really like this one of John's Tower. It's basically like an inverted rook piece from a chess. This isn't a battle map, but you're actually conveying more information to the GM by like these little, like level 4, I can tell that there's a giant banquet table there because that's illustrated in the book.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe it's not just the banquet table in that room. Like it can be, I don't know, I try to approach these maps more like theme park maps where you're thinking, okay, yes, I've got a sense of what's going to be there, but that may not be every single detail. Because again, that's not what I find important. Like I tend to do more theater of the mind or kind of just like abstract description. The maps are more for when I need a reference for describing that.
So like the final one-page dungeon is the skull. I really like the skull because it's almost like a catch-all. Basically, this is a giant skull floating offshore, and every time you go there, it's different. And it's a bunch of D20 tables, right?
Yeah, there's 100 rooms, and then I think I have around 20 different creatures at different sizes.
I really like designers and authors giving their readers permission, and this is really like you're giving the DM permission to do whatever they want here. If they've got a cool zine dungeon they just picked up and they want to like insert it here, they can. I'm wondering, are there any specific influences for some of these rooms or the overall idea? Or like, what was the design process like for coming up with
some of those rooms were me, and I'm not even dating myself. This is just showing that I still am in touch with old social media platforms. That's just me scrolling on Tumblr and occasionally seeing an image and then going, oh yeah, okay, great. And not to say that I'm just lifting verbatim, but I will see like, I don't know, a photo of a sunset and go, okay, yeah, there's a beach. Okay, what if there's like an endless beach? And then going, okay, well, what's interesting about this beach? And then kind of going from there. And I also do that because I think just pulling from my head is going to start to become repetitive. I've only got so many ideas ideas in there. So I try to keep things fresh. But yeah, my goal with that was, again, to drive discovery. And I think nothing can kind of reinforce that more than something that's different every time you go into it. But also to ask the GM to create something new each time felt unfair to say, oh yeah, this thing is always different. Good luck. So that's where I try to make it as easy to run as possible. Like sometimes if I haven't planned and sometimes my group will go, yeah, let's go to the skull and see what we can find. Then I will literally just like make up a map as I go, going in order from the rooms. Like, okay, you go into this room, whether they go left or right, this is the room you're going into next. And then obviously that map congeals and starts to kind of take true form as they explore. Hopefully that there's enough that if you need to improvise, that there's at least a base for you to build on, as opposed to just feeling like you're left adrift.
Well, even the creatures, like, you have a bunch of D20 tables for the different size creatures, but they're also like full stat blocks, but they're templates. Here I'm looking at 16 on skull creatures, medium, large. A slow moving blank, like really slow, like nearly slow motion. Is this slow motion? Like it's got stats, but like, is it a slow slug? Is it a slow animated chair? Is it a slow dragon? Like it could be whatever you want. And the GM doesn't have to do any math stat work. They could just use their creativity,
Yeah, and I think I made this point. Also, I feel it's unfair to describe it as a one-page dungeon when I think that takes up, I don't know, half a dozen or a dozen pages.
It's just in that section of one-page dungeons.
Right. Yeah, in the resources. Again, I want to trust the GM that if your dragon is made out of butter, then they're going to have a very different impact or resistances or weaknesses than a dragon made of forks. Like at the end of the day, I think what it hopefully nurtures is the flexibility for the GM to go, yeah, I know what I'm doing. Like you're right. If it's made of butter and it gets blasted by a fireball, it's going to probably almost entirely melt. Like maybe that's it. Maybe that's all you need to do. And maybe your problem solving worked. Like I try not to make these books to have the solution, but hopefully built up with enough problems that everyone can find their own solution on their own. And I mentioned this at the beginning of the book too, like there are gaps intentionally left because I think when you start to, as a GM, fill in those gaps on your own, then that starts to, one, it makes it yours, but two, it also allows you to have something to hold on to. Like again, when I'm reading other adventures, going, oh man, I got to remember so much of this plot and lore. But if it's just kind of like the vague kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say it's a book built on vibes, but like if it's a book that's driven by general feelings, then the nuances or the details of what's driving those feelings can be your own. And then you remember it more as opposed to just being an exercise in remembering or just kind of like memorization.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes from this being, quote, a setting book and not a, quote, adventure book. And I feel like you get a lot of those, especially with the kind of standard published 5e thing where like, oh, here's a 10-page adventure. Here are the plot points along the way. Some of them are more sandboxier than others, but this is on the other end of the scale where you're like, here are the tools. Here are the general motivators for these factions. In the sketch section in the back, you even show your little faction
relationships. Yeah. Relationship chart, maybe.
Thought cloud. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like that piece of information alone can be enough to drive a whole campaign rather than like, well, when they steal the scepter from the throne room, the lich will do this,
Right. Because that's just not fun to me. That's not just like fun to remember things and then execute it. Like then I just feel like I am the machine that is kind of producing the product that the instructions or that this diagram is giving me. I like to discover things as much as the players do while playing. Like I've run a bunch of different sessions in one-shots and long-form campaigns. And given the same ingredients, the adventures are so different because it's a setting. And I take this away from a couple different books, but I know we've talked about Hot Springs Island, and I think that's the big part, is the spirit of it is we've got these kind of like pieces on the board. How do you play the game? It's far more like chess or checkers for me than it is, I don't know, a video game. Like I think that's where some adventure books are written like video games or novels, and that's not my strength.
Yeah, or even if you compare older style video games to more Witcher or Breath of the Wild, where you really are, especially Skyrim, where you're really like, hey, I am making my own story. Like, I'm not going to go do those quests. I'm going to go do these. The world is ever evolving around you.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because I don't play games that are open-ended. Like I don't play like I was going to say Harvest Moon. Maybe that's not a good example. Stardew Valley or Minecraft. Like I don't play those sorts of games on my own for that. But when it comes to tabletop RPGs, that's all I want. Like all I want is just to kind of like hang around in this world and see what happens. So
buy a tavern, acquire your own pirate ship, sail to Hot Springs Island.
That'd be so cool. I've read stories of folks that have gone castles and start to run kingdoms and that. And I think that's so cool. Like that's just stuff that you can't do in a video game, or at least if you can, it's a very specific and it's meant to be. Like the video game is driving you to buy that castle.
All right, well, let's talk about the real reason we're here. Oz, a fantasy role-playing setting. How early in the process of making Neverland did you know you wanted to do Oz next? Was it like you couldn't wait to start, or is it more of a recent discovery for you?
No, it wasn't until after, because I didn't even know if I'd be able to get Neverland done. I was just like, oh, this is so much. What am I doing? I'll do it once and I'll be happy.
Soup to nuts, after you started actually making the book, not just running your game, how long did Neverland take you?
I mean, it's hard because I had a lot of it already written. From doing the pitch and then putting it together and then agreeing to what we were going to do, and then it files to Andrew's McMeal, it was probably about a year, probably a little less. And that's all the illustrations. That's writing a bunch more. I also did the layout design, so that's also laying out the book and all that. So start to finish, just shy of a year, maybe less.
If you include your campaign, you're talking, 2-3 years around.
What's funny is I actually hadn't been running Neverland for very long before I was like, I should try to share this with someone else. So it's probably maybe only an extra 6 months.
Oh, okay, great. So a year and a half.
Yeah. I think it's perfectly reasonable. Whereas I think Oz took less time. One, because I kind of, not that I know what I'm doing now, but that I had a better sense of what to expect and how to be more efficient. And it's also a different book, so it requires different things.
And you're a level 2 scribe now instead of a level 0.
Thank you. Always a challenge. And every time I start any sort of writing project, I go, oh, I don't know how to write. And then slowly and through months of editing, I go, okay, this is barely passable, and I get by.
So you decided, hey, I want to do a follow-up. I mean, I'm just kind of assuming here that you're like, this thing was a big hit. Part of the reason it's a big hit is because aside from the execution, when you pick it up, it feels like, oh, maybe I'm buying a Neverland storybook. Oh, this is a role-playing game. Like, I think the pitch to even non-gamers is there. Like we said at the beginning, the buy-in is already there. So with Oz, like, what about that world from overarching themes perspective grabbed you in? And can you spoil any of the things like you did in Neverland, like making Wendy a hag or anything like that you can talk about?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, and I guess to your earlier question of like how far into it, it was maybe a month or two after Neverland came out that I was like, I think I want to do this again. And I didn't know what it was going to be. What I did know and what kind of like drove it was, okay, if I'm going to make another book, what is the antithesis of Neverland? As much as this feels like a cousin to Neverland, I didn't want to try to make a younger sibling, because I wanted it to be its own thing. Like I want someone to, even if they've never heard of Neverland, if they for some reason pick up Oz, feel like, oh, okay, I get this. Like I assume it's still going to be the first book that someone picks up. But if someone has also picked up Neverland, they can see some parallels, and there's like a lot of similarities, and like the stat blocks are still approached the same way, because I still want to keep that. But I've also introduced some new stuff, again, from running Neverland and going, oh, I think boss battles need to work a little differently. So I've tried to introduce...
Like mechanically, what do you mean like they should work differently?
So what I've had trouble with is when I run... And I'm picturing a boss battle which is specifically a single creature. What I kind of approached it as is essentially like video games. And I think Final Fantasy does this a lot, where you fight like the first phase, and this isn't even my final form type thing. So I've tried to kind of like mechanically introduce that with kind of like different, it's almost like 2 stat blocks or sometimes 3 for a creature, of like once you've depleted their health to this point,
you destroy their mechanical armor, and then the thing busts out of inside.
My touchstone was, going back to Zelda, is I think they're called Dark Knots. I've never said that word out loud, but like they're big armored creatures, and in the 64 Zeldas, when you like do enough damage, then their armor falls off, and then they like start to move faster, and it changes. So I really liked that idea of being able to see progress, but also making it feel bigger than it is. So that's one thing that I've introduced in Oz that I don't have in Neverland. But things like that, like things where it's still its own thing, but is also, again, a cousin of Neverland. So this is a mega city. Like it's, instead of kind of like a sprawling world of Oz with all these kind of like different locations, I've really condensed it down as a challenge to myself, because I mean, like Neverland is kind of very wild and kind of like natural and untamed. So what's kind of the opposite of that to me is feeling like, oh, I picture an adventure where they have to infiltrate a dinner party and distract someone while they're also trying to steal this from the basement. Like that's kind of the task that I want them to accomplish. What setting works for that? And it's a big city. So I've broken it up into the 4 districts, which kind of relate to the 4 kind of like regions of Oz. I don't know, how familiar are you with Oz or the lore of Oz?
I mean, I would say I could probably watch Wizard of Oz in my head.
Have you read any of the books?
I haven't read any of the books. I didn't know there were books, and I don't remember Return to Oz hardly at all. So this is a good pitch. You can sell me on the world with,
Yeah. Okay. So first I will sell you on the books in that I think I love the Discworld novels. I don't know if you are into.
Yeah, I've only read Mort. I'm getting into them. Yeah.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay. Well, what I love about the Discworld series is that it is a setting. Like Discworld is like the only thing that keeps all those books together. Like sometimes characters repeat and the different focuses, but really the series is not like it's always following the same character. And I didn't realize that Oz had done that earlier and for a different audience. Like the Oz books, as much as they follow Dorothy fairly frequently, often will follow other children or other characters and different plots and in different parts of the world. And it just, I really liked that kind of feeling like it's a big world, lived in world. There are different regions in Oz, and I condensed that down into districts. So there's kind of like a north, south, east, and west district in Oz. And then at the center is the Emerald Citadel, which is kind of like what you would think of when you think of the Emerald City. So that is kind of like the base of operations. And yeah, each district is broken up into little neighborhoods. Again, it was like, what do I need to run a city or like an urban adventure? So I broke up each district into neighborhoods, and each neighborhood, which is now kind of like on a 2-page spread, has essentially just what I've described as like a news table. So there's navigation, which is just like landmarks. There's events, which is things that happen in the neighborhood. Worldlings, which are like kind of like NPCs, and then secrets, so like stuff to find. So there's like a table of all of that for each neighborhood. So really, again, if you flip to a neighborhood and you go, okay, what are they going to do? Here's the first thing they see. Here are people they encounter. And then we go from there. Like that's kind of the goal is like, how can I make this feel easy to run? And that was my approach.
So how many are there 4 neighborhoods? Or are there like a bunch of neighborhoods in 4 districts?
Oh yeah, there's 4 districts, and I think each district has 8 neighborhoods, and then there's like an outer region, and then so there's like 10 total areas. We're looking at 35 or 40-ish neighborhoods.
How rich is the source material? Like, my real question is, how much world building did you have to do here? Are most of these districts from your mind, or are they all kind of one sentence in the books, or like whole chapters?
Yeah, great question. So I would say probably about half of the neighborhoods come from either small, like little towns or like little areas. Like I think if you've read the books, you will see tons of references, but interpreted maybe in slightly new ways to fit this kind of setting. But I would say the rest were filled in from, okay, if this is a functioning metropolis, then what does it need? Like what, I guess it probably needs some sort of neighborhood dedicated to kind of like the military presence or just kind of like protecting the nation, or then where does all the food go, things like that. So it's a mix of both influence from the books and also just kind of like a practical balance of resources.
I'm imagining like a Oz Sim City that you're kind of playing. They're going to need a fantasy waste processing facility over here.
Yeah, there's a neighborhood called Junction, which is essentially where like a lot of the kind of like worker kind of communities like go to, and it's where like all the water is processed and where all the kind of like stuff is. Like it's just like, oh, if you think of like the kind of like least interesting industrial area, then that's where it is. But there's still stuff that happens there, and there are still people that live there or work there that you'll run into. Like you can still spend time in Junction, but it's just going to have a very different vibe than the kind of like upper kind of like high society, like Green Gardens neighborhood called Emerald Views, because you can see the Emerald Citadel. So it's like where the rich people live because they have like the best view. So just like, again, I think what I want is how I approach the neighborhoods in the same way at Neverland of going, oh, where are we going to find that water horse? I want someone to either go through these different neighborhoods and maybe have no interest in spending time in the archives, but then later going, oh, we need to look something up. I'm sure there's a library in every neighborhood, but the archives probably has the biggest, or we know it has the biggest library. So let's go over there. Like I want them to kind of like be able to like learn from the setting and use and exploit it and go, oh yeah, if we want to cause some trouble to the water system, or if we think someone's going to tamper with the water system, then we need to go to Junction because that's probably where they're going to do it. So that's my goal with kind of like designing all these different neighborhoods. It's a lot, but it hopefully makes sense both to the players and the GM.
So this is a 5e book. Can you give our listeners some examples of how you've D&Dified Oz?
Oh yeah. Okay, so a Tin Woodman, or like the Tin Man, he is weak to water, and when he is hit with water, then his speed slows each
Of
kind of
course.
round, unless he uses a bonus action to use an oil can. But he can also use that bonus action to use the oil can to like essentially like toss oil into an area, which then maybe an ally could then light on fire later. Like I don't know if that's a good example, but I think
That's
that's
a
one way
perfect
where I've kind of
example.
taken something and made it into a proper like functioning mechanic. And again, hopefully works logically. Like, oh yeah, he's the Tin Man, let's hit him with water. Okay, well if they do that, then what is going to be some benefit to the players if they are thinking smart? Then hopefully I've given them that.
Do you have any like monster examples?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So the winged monkeys, and there are a couple of different groups that work like this, but the winged monkeys can like pick you up and then drop you. But if they work together, like if you have a half a dozen winged monkeys, then it adds to their, or makes the save more difficult and adds to their strength. So that way, 6 winged monkeys picking up one character is more efficient than just one monkey trying to pick up a single character. So things like that. Like I try to make a monster or to design a stat block of like, okay, what's something interesting they're going to do? And if I only get to run it once, what's the cool thing I'm going to run as the GM? So that way the players go, oh no, and then have to figure out that problem. So that's the
Wait,
goal.
is there like like I said, I'm not being that familiar with the setting besides the big movie everyone's seen. What
Hmm.
time period are you in? Like, is the Wicked Witch of the West a thing?
Yeah. So again, where I've approached Neverland with the theme of exploration, the theme of Oz is social. Like at those pillars of D&D, I'm trying to kind of go through the pillars. So Oz is more politically based. Each district is governed by a single figurehead, and that title is Witch, Wizard, or Warden. So depending on who is in that position, they're the Witch of the West or the Wizard of the North. And then the locals of that area will likely add an additional adjective to describe them. So whether they're a nice or kind of not nice leader will be how they're titled. So you could have a Wicked Witch of the East, but it not be who you think it is. Or you could have a wonderful Wizard of the West, but again, not who you think it is.
Could it be one of the players eventually?
Oh yeah, I have a
Yeah.
plot hook that a player is kind of essentially just bestowed the title of Warden of Munchkin district. So a bunch of Munchkins, which again is more like a title for the people who live in the Munchkin district, not like a specific race or
Okay.
a denotion of size. Yeah, you essentially just show up and are now suddenly the Warden of Munchkin district. So like, what do you do? And oh, now I'm like a politician. How do I have to deal with these things? But also I need to like save my brother or whatever it is. So again, I wanted it to be a very different feel from Neverland, and that I just don't want you to be like going through the same motions but in a different island, but it still has that same kind of like drive based on the player choices. So maybe the players elect someone else or do something dangerous or try to overthrow the princess and then become the ruler of Oz. Like who knows and who cares? Let's find out together. So that's the goal.
I mean, I think it's obvious that it wouldn't be, but I really like that it's not just like a reskin of Neverland. It's not just like, okay, here's the same things, but with a different, coat of paint.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, and that's my goal, because like I think I want you to be able to open up a spread and go, oh, I can run this as well as Neverland, but it functions differently. Like the tables are a little different and the encounters are different, but it still functions the same way. So again, I kind of go with Ocarina of Time to Majora's Mask. Like, oh yeah, this is still using a lot of the same stuff, but it's a very different feel.
Is there a over the rainbow location or mechanic? I mean, there's got to be, right?
Because Oz is so much bigger, there is a Rainbow Realm, but I'm not treating it as robustly as Elfame is in Neverland.
Yeah, okay.
Like I don't assume that you're going to go there. Characters can go there, and rainbows do play a role in Oz, but it's not as intense. Again, what I didn't want is, every book has 2 settings in it. Like I think Oz was like, okay, this feels more like I can run blades in the dark in here, and it has a very different vibe than another setting type thing.
Yeah, for our listeners, in Neverland, the Fey realm, if you will, is called Elfame, and it's like a whole other location with a whole other set of NPCs. So
yeah, and functions a little differently than the rest of Neverland. My goal with Oz was I wanted to feel like its own thing and not just, I did this in Neverland, so I'm going to do this in Oz type thing. It's like what makes sense for this setting and for this sort of adventure.
So I'm looking at the like very few previews that there are for Oz, and one of them on Amazon has these like, which I mistakenly thought were filler text. They're kind of like
Okay.
template stat blocks for animals. Can you kind of explain what this is and how it gets used?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I've broken it down. Animals are as kind of like sentient and talk and as whimsical as you'd expect in Oz. So I didn't want to do a stat block for a bison and a rhino and a hippo. So I've condensed it down into just like a large animal. And then you can kind of use that as necessary if you need to use stats. And I've done that for the different sizes. What I've also done is like a stat block for a small creature, but then also a small swarm. And instead of like with 5e, swarms kind of just like exist as like a single creature, and kind of like what we were talking about with boss battles, I've approached swarms as this kind of like scalable thing. So like if you've angered a family of mice and they act as a swarm, that's going to be very, very different than if you've angered an apartment building full of mice and they all come out and attack you. So I've tried to scale it so that way I treat it almost like pools. So one pool of mice is going to be less of a threat than 10 pools of mice. Again, it scales. So their attack is going to be X equal to the number of pools. And similarly, as you're chipping away at the swarm and as you kill a handful of mice, then the pools decrease. So if you have the amount of mice, then you've gone from a 10 pool down to a 5 pool. They're not going to be as threatening as a 10 pool creature or like swarm of mice. So the bonuses change. This is the first time I've talked about this, so I don't know if I'm doing a great job.
No, I get. I mean, I think it helps if you look at it. But like, for example, we're looking at animals, small, comma, swarm. Their saves are X plus 3, X plus 1, and X, and their bite attack is XD4 plus X. So if you have 10 pool giant swarm of mice, they're doing 10d4 plus 10 damage. Mechanically,
far
it makes
more dangerous.
sense.
Far more dangerous than a small single pool. And I'll read just kind of like some stuff to explain the pools. So essentially, X equals the number of pools, maximum of 10, minimum of 1. You can combine or divide the pools as a reaction. So what I also wanted was, you've got this big swarm and they're all attacking one creature, but then the paladin slices a sword. So then they split up and then move to two different groups. So now it's 2 pools of 5, and mechanically they will do the similar amount of damage, but now they get to act as 2 different creatures. And again, I want you to feel like, oh, it's not just a single thing. It's like whack-a-mole. Like you've crushed some of them, but now they've split up into smaller groups and are now kind of attacking different ways.
I love that the art on this page, you have like a swarm of mice they're holding needles as swords. And it kind of reminds me of like Mouse Guard meets Redwall Mossflower,
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of like vibe I want you to get when you're fighting these creatures. Like it's not just kind of like simple-minded creatures. Like the animals of Oz are fairly intelligent, so they're going to act fairly intelligently. So hopefully giving them a bit of clothing and weaponry kind of communicates that.
You also have this kind of like a stork. It really reminds me of when, you tell me if I hit the influence here, but it really reminds me of when Robin Hood in the Disney animated Robin Hood dresses up as a stork at the archery contest.
In the archery competition, that is an interesting insight. I can neither confirm nor deny that influence. But I appreciate that you saw that.
I'm wondering now if your next book might perhaps be Robin Hood, because I feel like that would be a great, a great next book for you. You don't have to comment on that, but
no, I'm still early stages. Again, I think it's only after a bit of time of the book being out that I go, yeah, okay, I'm going to do this again.
So you don't even know.
I don't know what it would be. What I do know is, and we can kind of, because we've alluded to this, the 3 pillars of D&D in theory being exploration, social, and combat. So while I think both of these books have all 3, I think one kind of comes to the forefront more than the other. My goal is to hopefully find some way to find a book that I can focus more on combat, which is a real challenge for me as someone who's like, I don't play a combat heavy or run a combat heavy adventure. And none of my settings are really kind of like violent or aggressive, which is like, it can be like in the same way Return to Oz is a far darker and scarier version of The Wizard of Oz. It's up to the GM, but I want to make a book that is like, yeah, you're going to get into fights. Like it's just inevitable. You're going to have to make a character that's ready to fight. So that's my goal. What that is, I don't know.
I have 3 pitches for you.
Okay.
And if you do any of them, I want a EP credit in the book.
Okay.
Not really. The first is Robin Hood, because I think that the art style would go great, storybook style. There's tons of lore there. The second is like Greek mythology, because I feel like there's lots of monsters to fight and there's lots of lore to draw on. But then the third is like, dude, I feel like what color's the Oz book? Is it blue?
Yeah, it's blue with like an emerald foil on the front. Yep.
Yeah, maybe like a red King Arthur book could be a really nice.
Interesting.
Dude, there's so much lore there for you, you know?
Yeah, that's fun. I do have a property in mind, or like a setting in mind, and you did not say it, so that's fun.
Keeping our listeners thinking. I like it.
I will give you that I would like to see a red cover, because then it's like RGB, and I think there's just like all these like fun little things of just like the 3 on the front.
I mean, and then, you know, if you keep going and get to 6 or 7, you can do the full rainbow eventually. You know,
like a yellow. What would be the yellow cover book?
I mean, yellow would have been good for Oz, Yellow Brick Road and stuff.
What I didn't want it to be is just a reverse of Neverland, which is like the green with the gold foil. So I didn't want it to just be yellow with green foil. So I don't know. These are the weird design choices that I go, I don't know. I don't want that. So that's where I went with the blue.
Well, we're waiting with bated breath to know what the next one's going to be.
Oh, thank you. Oz isn't even out yet, but I'll get there. And I'll come back and we can talk about whatever it is when I
already pre-ordered Oz, so it's like, you know.
Oh, thanks.
We're ready for the next one, you know. I want to talk to you a bit about, you have 2 really cool sections in Neverland. One is your sketchbook, which I've never seen a RPG designer include their creative process at the back of the book. I just wanted to say I appreciated that. But next to that, you have the external and complementary resources, in which you list, this is how I found out about Hot Springs Island. You also list Carapace by Goblin's Henchmen and Gardens of, I think it's Yin. If you have anything you want to include about those, please do. But I really wanted to ask you about your art influences, all of which I looked up. We probably don't have time to go into all of them, but some of these, particularly Mary Blair and David Hall, I feel are like, you have to give them some attention in order to understand Andrew Kolb's work, right? Especially Mary Blair. She did like concept art for a lot of the old animated Disney movies. I'm assuming the original Peter Pan.
Yep.
Can you maybe talk about their influence, your work? You have this next paragraph too with John Bauer and Edmund Dulac. These kind of like, they almost look like tarot card illustrators.
Yeah, like kind of turn of the century, kind of industrial revolution illustrations.
I want to hear about your influences as an illustrator.
Great. Yeah, no. So I think Blair is up there with kind of one of the core influences on my work. Like what she does with color and shape is so simple but so communicative. Like I think what I love about her work is I really get a feel for the space, even though there isn't a lot of detail. And I think you can see a lot of her influences in the kind of various chapter illustrations. Maybe not in the character illustrations, because those I tried to go a bit more realistic, but in the kind of like tone illustrations to kind of have that playful nature to it. Her use of lighting also really kind of does a great job of making things feel not necessarily threatening, but that there's like a small element of danger, which I also really like. The others, I think, were more of an influence of that kind of danger of fairy tale. Like, and I think that's my whole thing with fairies is I always really like the idea of, they're like beautiful and kind of like charming and whimsical, but also they will steal babies and they will turn you into a frog if you like. That kind of fleeting or fair weather kindness, I think is really fun. And I thought those influences or those artists really kind of captured that feeling of like, you know, you just got half of a woman's face peering out of the water, like just like something slightly unsettling, but still beautiful. Like it's that kind of fine line. So those are major influences. Outside of what's listed in the book, I will also say, and kind of playing back to Mary Blair and also tying back into the sketchbook, the sketchbook came from me at that time. Andrew McNeil said, we have a few extra pages just based on kind of like what the printer can do. Is there something you want to do with that? We can do like line pages for notes or something. And I was like kind of racking my brain because like the line, like ruled pages kind of felt like filler. I didn't want to leave them blank, but I was reading through my library edition copies of Hellboy, and Mike Mignola is a big influence on my work. Not necessarily aesthetic, but I think just like, again, the use of lighting and like the Hellboy series is great for kind of like taking fairy tales and that kind of like weird whimsical element, but also making it dangerous. And in those library editions of the book, he has like essentially what I've done. Like I've just stolen that. It's a sketchbook section at the back where he'll show character sketches and he'll show kind of like early page layouts. And I was like, I love this. Like, I love seeing this. Why don't I do this? Like, maybe people will be interested in it. And if not, that's okay. But I have all this like rough work that I had done. So why don't we put that in the book? So AMU was really great about letting me do that. So that's where kind of the sketchbook came from, was I put in what I would love to see from others. And I hope others kind of take from that and go, yeah, I will show my process because it's really interesting. I know everyone works differently. So I would love to see other people's approach to it. I know we really got off of illustration influences, but the sketchbook is something I'm really proud about.
Because,
yeah.
Like you talk here about how you started with very small, they look like maybe pencil sketches. They look hand done. And I'm like, oh, whoa. I'm not leaving my computer. Like, as an illustrator, I can't get past the permanence of paper. And so it's just really cool to see somebody else's process, to be like, okay, this is like, it's iterative and you're starting with pencil and then blowing it up to, I'm assuming you're using Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator.
No, I use Photoshop. I have like a drawing tablet because I'm not very good with like mouse on the screen. So drawing on a tablet feels almost as natural as drawing on paper. If I may, like, what's your process? How do you approach your illustrations?
I just start in Photoshop. Sometimes I start in Procreate on my iPad, just because I can be anywhere for that, but I always end up in Photoshop. I guess just the style of your work, I just assumed, because it's very, it almost looks vector. I just assumed Illustrator, but I love that it's Photoshop.
Thanks.
But yeah, for me, I just start there, and then sometimes I do a sketch and then make it like a blue line layer and go over top. And then other times I just go, Now,
how do you approach it? So a layout on a page where you've got the text and the illustration. What is your kind of sequence of events for it all coming together? Like you talked about, okay, I've written this new mechanic. Now I've got an illustration there. Do you finish and like complete all of your text and then do the illustration after? Do you change the text to suit the illustration? Like what's the back and forth?
It depends on what I'm working on, but if it's something like a monster, let's say, I'll be like, I want to make this monster, and then I'll draw it, and then I'll usually like make that a smart object and put it in a page layout Photoshop file that I put as the background in InDesign. And often I'll like lay out the text, and when I get a lot of text and it's working or not working, I'll screenshot the InDesign and pull it back in Photoshop and then move the elements around. Like I'll just screenshot just the text and move it around. There's a lot of back and forth. I like have the two programs open constantly. I'm constantly refreshing that Photoshop link. Is that
Cool.
similar for you at all? Or?
Yeah. And again, kind of what we were talking about earlier, like I think it's kind of like the luxury of working. And actually, so I include a sketchbook section in Oz as well. And I talk more about the page layout. And I also talk about like kind of like, you know what, if you're going to do both, you might as well play back and forth. Like sometimes I will get stuck and go, wait, why am I trying to fit this illustration? Why don't I just change the text or edit it down to be more efficient? Or I finished an illustration and realized, oh, my description talks about this feature and I haven't included it in the drawing. Sometimes I just delete that description because I'm not going to change the drawing now. Like at the end of the day, I can do that. So why not? And no one knows, except for obviously I've written it now and published it in a book, but like, it doesn't matter. Like it's the opportunity to be able to kind of like work at both at the same time and go back and forth. And sometimes the illustration influences text and sometimes the text influences, like it's a process. So I'm glad to hear that you kind of do the same thing too. And that I'm not just a man alone on this island.
No, it's the beauty and the curse of doing both. Like if you're laying it out only, you have to ask for permission to delete things, Right. But for me, all the time, I'm removing words to get it to one column instead of two, because I need an illustration there, or I don't want to spread it to another page. I try to keep everything, I don't ever bleed over to a second page if I can, because I'm really thinking about the final book,
Right.
But this is my first book. Pirate Borg is my first book. So I'm sure I'll get it and be like, oh my God, why did I do that?
Right. I mean, again, I've learned so much from doing the first book that it kind of carried over to the second, that I will then also carry over into whatever happens next. Like at the end of the day, I am also trying not to be too precious and going like, okay, I want to keep doing this and I'm going to make mistakes along the way. And that's okay. I think that's it.
Hold fast, wretched sailor. We brace for the broadside barrage.
First RPG you ever played?
First RPG I ever played was Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, The Lost Mines of Phandelver.
I love that. You're like a modern RPG creator.
I'm just a baby.
Most recent RPG system that you've played, is that still 5th edition?
Yeah, tricky because I'm running for players. I tend to be driven by what the players want to play, and no complaints. I think that's what is like most popular, at least in the kind of groups that I'm playing with, or for folks who have not played before. because they've kind of heard of it, it feels like they're more comfortable trying it out. I've read a bunch of other systems. I really would like to run, talking about like a more combat-driven adventure, I'd love to run Old School Essentials, really kind of like pare it down. That's for someday. Maybe I'll run a one-shot at a gaming convention or something and just be like, please come, please play. So
I have Old School Essentials, and yesterday on Facebook Marketplace, I acquired both a basic and expert box sets.
Whoa.
So I'm very excited. I'm diving in with both hands. Does that answer my next question? System you've yet to try but want to. Is there another one besides Old School Essentials?
So it's a game, I guess maybe a game specific that I'd purchased or kickstarted called Babes in the Wood. And it's kind of like an over the garden wall Adventure Time kind of vibe. Like it's very kind of like, I mean, if my work is genial, this is like saccharine. Like it's very, very gentle, like children and forest animals living in a kind of like a semi-dangerous woods. I'd love to run a game in that. And I think when my friends' kids get old enough that we're kind of doing an introduction into it, that'll absolutely be either when I run or I suggested that we play in. Yeah.
Favorite monster in the 5th edition monster manual? Doesn't have to be 5th edition, but favorite D&D monster,
Oh, okay. Because I was going to say, like, my favorite monster is always goblins. I always like playing goblins. I like just, they're kind of like small kids. Like, and I run them like New York cab drivers from the 70s and 80s. So just like, they're kind of dangerous, but also kind of like, just like don't cross this type thing. Kind of like greasers. Yeah. I don't know. That's my favorite, but you're right. So okay, a specific D&D creature. I really like the aesthetic of Beholders, but I think I like the play of a gelatinous cube more.
So classic.
Yeah.
Okay, my second part is, what's your favorite monster from Neverland?
Oh, my favorite monster from Neverland. Oh, good question. I would say I really like the Spotted Slugs. No one has really interacted with them yet or used them, but they're essentially these kind of like oversized, poisonous colored slugs that...
When you say no one has interacted, you mean in your campaign, right?
Sorry, in my campaign, yeah. In my encounter running Neverland. No, I'm sure lots of people have run into the Spotted Slugs, but I'll just read their description. Brilliantly colored and dangerous in numbers, this slug can grow up to the size of an adult human arm. It feeds off of magic, and the young can be used to store spells. I was really excited. No one's used them yet, because anytime I describe these slugs that are like yellow with green spots or red with purple spots, they're like, oh no, that's danger, goodbye. And I'm like, no, come and play with them. Someday I'm going to have some enemy just like covered in slugs using them to cast spells, and I'm excited for that. So that's my favorite, maybe only because I haven't gotten to use them yet.
Your Neverland game sounds like a lot of fun. That table has a lot of fun. Third part, favorite Oz monster.
I haven't run as much Oz yet, so I haven't gotten to touch on all of them. What I do like, okay, I will pull them up, and this is again, maybe cheating because of my other answers. They're called Goozle Goblins, which is another creature from the books. I've essentially designed them to be almost like, picture like a gremlin meets a Furby. Like, what if the kind of Mogwais got the dangerous but kept the fur? And they're really fun, but they can't be killed unless you cut out their tongues. So a fun little mechanic.
Spoiler!
Yeah. Well, that's fine. My players have encountered them and sorted out that puzzle now. So they kind of like die and then they kind of like reinflate if they haven't been detongued. I don't know. I really like running them because again, they're basically goblins. They're just like little chaotic and they're like gremlins. I run goblins like gremlins. They're just like not a big threat when they're alone, but when there's a bunch of them, they can cause some trouble.
My analog for goblins in the Dark Caribbean are basically kind of what you described, but goblin monkeys. Take goblins and just call them monkeys. You kind of get them in Magic the Gathering expansion, Ixalan, where you got these like pirate monkeys. They steal pirate gear and swing. I love that. Hook from 1991. Yay or nay?
You know what? I haven't watched it in a number of years, but I'm gonna go yay. I like the baseball. Like I like that kind of humanizing of the enemy. I like the fantasy kind of like imagination food that that shows up in my Neverland. I like the kind of like older kind of carrying on or passing on the torch. Yeah, I'm into it. I don't know if it holds up, but I like the idea that drove that movie. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like it has very low ratings on like IMDb, but like for me, it's like one of my, like if you seen Inside Out, it's like one of my core memories is watching Hook.
Yeah, I wonder why there aren't more sequels or more movies that do that, like kind of take something that's well known and classic and then kind of go later.
And Dustin Hoffman as Hook, like
yeah.
Is that who you picture when you are running your game?
Yeah,
Is it
yeah.
Hook?
I don't know if I do a very good Dustin Hoffman, but
But in your mind's eye, it's
yeah,
Dustin
it does a really
Hoffman.
good job of balancing what I think is core to Hook's principle, which is kind of like a gentleman amongst like criminals. Like I really like the contrast of the one who's running this kind of disastrous ship is like believes himself to be a high society. I love that as a character beat.
Okay, Smee or Rufio?
I still like Smee. Maybe I'm a traditionalist, but I like their interplay as well, both in the original books
Bob
and
Hoskins,
in the movies.
come on.
Yeah.
Okay, you, Andrew Kolb, are suddenly a 5th level PC. What class are you?
A wizard. I just like the classics. I like being a simple guy with a bunch of silly spells in like a star-covered robe with a pointy star-covered hat. Just like a book, a beard, an orb. That's all I want.
Add an entry to the What's in the cargo hold of the Ship of the Dead D100 table.
So I will say there's like a large conch shell, but when you hear it, it's a song that you can't hear the words to until you get closer to the body of who was singing it.
I love that. That's so good. Favorite size die?
D6. I like it. It's stable. It makes sense. It's classic.
Neverland hex or one-page dungeon you are most fond of?
Ooh, I do like the inverted tower. I think that is fun. It's very linear. Like it really goes against dungeon principles in that like there's really only one way in or out. But I think that plays well to the kind of like sense of kind of stress or kind of isolation or kind of like you're surrounded, which I think plays well into kind of John's kind of posturing. So I'm really happy with how that one came together.
Favorite libation or beverage during your RPG sessions?
Oh yeah, I've heard you ask this before, and when I heard it, I went, "Oh, I'm just a water guy." Like I think when I'm running a game, I will just go water. But I think in general, I also really like a soda. Actually, no, I will say a milkshake. So do you know what? I would say, I think if the group brought drinks, if there's beers and that, maybe I would say yes. But if someone came with like a quartet of milkshakes and we're just like handing them out to the table, inspiration all around.
Are you like, give me like a McDonald's, or you want like a highfalutin,
Oh no, I have
shake?
I have the lowest standards. I will take whatever milkshake you get me. Like if it's from a roadside stand, it's still going to be good. It's just like sugar on cream. Like you can't go wrong. No complaints.
Are you going to any conventions this year?
So I don't know if listeners know this about me, but I'm Canadian, and that makes it tricky, especially with the kind of like big ones being stateside. So I don't personally tend to go.
I was really like, I hope Andrew's going to be at Gen Con, but
yeah, it's just like the international travel is still kind of like tricky. Like from like my own, to be completely honest, just like my own budget, and it's just like it's different for me kind of going international as opposed to domestic. I would love to find more in Canada here. So if any of your listeners are Canadian and have any to suggest, then I will gladly accept those messages.
What part of Canada?
Ontario, but you know what? It's pretty easy to fly or get a train somewhere else, so I'll go. It's just.
But I mean, like Vancouver is a bit far, you know.
It is maybe a 3-hour flight or so. Okay. Maybe I'm wrong. I haven't traveled in a while, so we'll get there.
Video or computer game you've logged the most hours playing?
I'll give you 2. So I'd say probably because I've played through Breath of the Wild, I think twice. I think it has to be the most number of hours. But I would say the only other games that I've really done that with, outside of some other Zelda games, is Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo. That's another kind of big influence on me for like game design and also just writing. Like it's just such a tight plot, character design. It's fun, but it's also serious. Like Chrono Trigger is a big one for me.
Is there really no place like home?
Yeah, you know what? I think there is. I think how you describe home is up to you. But I would say once you find that or once you have that, yeah, there really is no place like it.
And my final question. What's your happy thought?
Oh, thinking about that burger and milkshake I'm going to eat. That's it.
Nice. All right, Andrew, you have an active blog. I will link it in the show notes, but do you want to plug it? And any other spots that you want to plug, now is the time.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I would say so my website is Kolb is Neat. Like my last name is Neat. That's my website. And that leads to the blog and Twitter.
KOLBisneat.com.
Yeah, you got it. And I think if you even just Google my name, that should pop up. But that leads to the blog and a bunch of other stuff.
Where is the best place for you to pre-order Oz?
If you're going to order online, I will say picking a site doesn't matter too much, but leaving reviews does. So if if you're going budget and Amazon is the cheapest, I get that. But I would say if you can leave a review or comment, then that's cool. If you can afford it and you have a local game shop, that's also nice too. If you call them and just say, hey, I want to pick up this game, can you pre-order it for me? Then that kind of like helps locally too. So that's my kind of like go-to. Like if you're going budget, go online and that's fine, but maybe leave a review or find your local game shop. Yeah.
I'm assuming the same answer kind of applies to if you want to find Neverland. Just get it where you need to, but leave a review if you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've been listening to the Ship of the Dead podcast. Email your questions, comments, and buried treasure tips to shipofthedead@limithron.com. You can support the program, join our Discord server, get early access to new episodes, and instantly download hundreds of battle maps, assets, and adventures at limithron.com/Patreon. Tiers start as low as $2 a release, and you only get charged when I make something new. Pirate Borg, my rules-light, rum-infested hack of Morkborg, is available for pre-order at pirateborg.com. Ship of the Dead is produced by Limithron LLC, our audio editor is Matt Kepler, and our music is by Alexander Miller.